Welcome to China in Context from the SOAS China Institute at the University of London. I'm Duncan Hewitt. There's been a lot of talk recently about China's demographic challenges, a fast-ageing population, a fall in the number of marriages and record low birth rates despite the relaxation of the one-child policy 10 years ago, as well as a rise in divorce rates over the past 2 decades. So what is going on in Chinese families and relationships? Well, today we're joined by Liu Jieyu, also known as Jieyu Liu, Professor of Sociology and China Studies here at SOAS and co-editor of the prestigious SOAS journal, the China Quarterly. She's also the author of a new book which seeks to shed light on Chinese families and how they've adapted to the changes in society over recent decades. It's called Embedded Generations, Family Life and Social Change in Contemporary China, and it's based on interviews with more than 200 people from 3 generations, from those born in the 1930s and 40s to those born in the 1990s and beyond, and it goes into enormous detail about their experiences of childhood, relationships, sex and marriage, grandparenting and ageing. It also covers a wide social and geographical spectrum. It's based on interviews in 3 villages in northern, central and southeastern China and in 3 cities, Tianjin in the north, Xi'an in the west and Guangzhou in the south. Well, Professor Liu, thank you very much for joining us. So your previous books focused on gender issues in the workplace in China, but this new book really delves into every aspect of people's personal lives with some remarkably frank and open interviews. And among your conclusions, you push back to some extent against the application of traditional sociological theories of modernization and individualization to contemporary China. You say that there are still many continuities and reinventions of tradition which affect people's lives today. So perhaps you could start by explaining the significance of the book's title, Embedded Generations.
So in terms of the embedded generations, it entails several layers of meaning. The first layer, the embeddedness, means that one's family life and family practices are always embedded in the institutional context of their time, in terms of the policy and institutional arrangement, employment, livelihood. All these situations shape people's behavior. And then the second layer of embeddedness, which I aim to say that each generation does not stand on its own. Instead, it's linked with other generations. There is a constant process of intergenerational transmission and negotiation at the everyday level.
And is that something that you think is much more powerful in China than in other societies?
I think the Chinese institutional context determines the way that there is a very strong interdependence between generations in Chinese societies. Despite the increase of welfare provision, the government and the society still put a lot of expectation upon the children to fulfill these kind of old age support roles and etc.
Because you do touch on the idea that many people have assumed that China will sort of modernize in similar ways to other societies. But you make this point in the book. You say the youngest generation, so that's now people who are growing up, maybe just getting married, that you say that they exhibit superficially similar trends to Western societies, and that may be, for example, reduction in the fertility rate and the formation of more nuclear families rather than multi-generational. But you say that the meaning and consequences of these practices are profoundly different, and that Chinese families continue to honor traditional, in inverted commas, intergenerational, lifelong reciprocity. So what are the key reasons? It's not just the way that the social system is set up now. I mean, presumably you think that there are also other deep-rooted reasons for this to be the case.
I think modernization takes its own path. In many ways, especially in the cities, in my study, they are, I think, even more modern than London in terms of infrastructure, the convenience and everything. But the rural areas are really left behind. And in terms of very basic infrastructure was still not in place, even like the basic sanitary facilities, etc. So that's the reason why I propose. One is these kind of interdependence and intergenerational reciprocity was caused by the Chinese policy framework, which strengthened the interdependence between generations. The second layer, what I teased out from my data, is that this intergenerational transmission of values are happening at the everyday level.
So that's despite many changes in the environment that the young people are growing up in.
The changes are not linear. Sometimes the changes are the adaptations of the old forms. It's not a break with the past, rather it's kind of a revival or readaptation of the existing forms. For example, you just highlighted the nuclear living has become a norm for urban younger generation. When they get married, most likely they were living on their own. However, the interesting thing is that marital house, marital apartment is always paid by the man's family, which is basically adapting the traditional patriarchal custom to the 21st century. And there are also very close intergenerational connections. Even they live on their own. A lot of the younger generation still go to their parents' home for dinners. And then when they have children, grandparenting become a norm. These grandparents' involvement is really intensified as the society modernizes.
And that's one thing that you highlight a lot, the role of grandparents and also the changing attitudes of young people to the older generations. It's an example of the incredible detail that you go into in this study, and it's based on 260 interviews carried out over quite a few years. So you, I believe, began your own field work in 2011. But this whole project carried on until around 2021 in several phases. So can you explain a little bit about how you got the idea to do this? I believe that you started off in two different villages, one in Shandong province in the east of China and one in Hunan in the south.
Yes, so that project actually was concerned with aging rural China. In particular, I wanted to explore the impact of rural to urban migration upon the familiar support system in rural villages, especially what kind of support arrangements are in place for those elderly people in rural China. I utilized the life history approach to explore their family lives. So from that project, I collected a lot of data that was not highly relevant for that project. For example, their childhood experience, their marriage, which encouraged me to do more research in this area because I found it fascinating. So that's how I decided to broaden my original research to include other aspects of family life, to including childhood and marriage and sex and intimacy, and also to include the different, bringing another village, the Fujian village, because what I found that, especially the villages, the differences can be profound depending on the migration trajectories and the village custom, and then the impact of the way the family practice are negotiated. And also I decided to include the urban side. So in that way, this study is really the first of its kind to do this comprehensive comparison of the multiple urban and rural sides and how family life have shifted across 70 years in China.
But you mentioned that you started out in these villages where many people were migrating from the countryside to work in cities. And that really has been one of the huge stories of China over the last few decades. And obviously, one of the things that you note is that many of the young generation who have gone out to work in cities from the villages have left their children behind, or in some cases, taken their children with them when they're very small to the cities where they're working, but then brought them back. Many of the children then were brought up by grandparents, and that gave rise to this phrase which you question a little bit in the book of left behind children. And there was a lot of media reporting of this. And the implication was that these children were always going to struggle because they were being often brought up by grandparents who were not very educated, and they didn't have so much care and intimacy with their parents. What's your feeling about the impact of that on Chinese society as a whole? And has that been misunderstood?
I think, yes. In the book, I didn't attribute the separation as the source of these rural children's predicament. I think it's more the structural inequality they experienced. For example,
Structural inequality,
yeah,
yeah.
it's the school setting. I think a lot of media put the emphasis on their parental fault. I don't think it's that. I don't think the parents are, even they stay behind. I mean, they will still suffer the same kind of poverty, and in terms of the lack of resources in schooling. And also there was a process of consolidation of village schools. These children have to travel very far to the schools in the township level. Is this lack of development and resources investment in the rural educational system that led to they are left behind in that sense. In some of the cases, they had a good relationship with their grandparents, and they actually were well looked after. But of course, these parents and grandparents, they were illiterate. So they couldn't provide the educational support that urban parents could provide. So that's the main argument I want to put forward in the book. Over time, there is a process of intergenerational reproduction of inequalities happening at the childhood level.
You do obviously include some examples of people from rural backgrounds who have succeeded in going to university and having an urban lifestyle after they graduate. But your argument is that despite this, overall, there's still this sort of growing divide between people from rural and urban backgrounds. Do you not feel that government attempts to put more money into rural areas and to boost social welfare in some of the rural areas has helped a little bit in this respect?
In a way, from my feudal experience, I can see the effect of government policy because I think none of the villages suffer from hunger. That's a fact I can see. And people eat well. The most things they struggle with is the cash income. The rural families has very limited cash income, and borrowing money is a recurring thing in their family life. They had to borrow money from relatives and etc. And I think in the most recent common prosperity initiatives, so again, the rural development was listed as one of the issues the government want to tackle. So I really welcome this kind of approach. But I think it's just too early to judge how these policies can be implemented at the grassroots level and how that can transform the rural families, people's lives.
So that's the slogan which we've heard a lot more about in recent years. The goal of the party, the Communist Party, is to create common prosperity for all, the sort of 小康社会. But you quote various families in different parts of the country. There's a woman from Shandong in the countryside, and then she got to university and eventually came back to work in a local town as a teacher. But she had to set these very strict homework schedules for her own child because she felt that, as many people do, you suggest, only education could give the younger generation a chance to improve their lives. And then you give a very different example of a mother in Guangzhou in the south, in the big city, whose daughter was at a private school and she would go skiing or horse riding, and their aim was that she would go to a university outside China. So you give these examples in a way to highlight the continuation of these inequalities.
In a way, the rural lady in my chapter 1, she has managed to overcome that barrier herself. But again, in this national race, her family is still left behind in comparison with these wealthy families in big cities like Guangzhou. So a lot of these wealthy families will tend to send their children to private school, which is beyond the means of this rural lady who managed to go to university herself.
And then you have another example of someone from
The same village.
Called Miss Yuan, is it?
She was in the same village as Miss Wang, but she didn't manage. Miss Wang managed to get to university and landing the job as a school teacher, but she reproduced her parents' life as a migrant worker. And then, in a way, I could predict that her daughter most likely will end up to be a migrant worker again.
But I mean, we have heard a lot of talk of the huge wave of rural-urban migration, which fueled China's economic development from the 1990s up till the recent period, that has slowed down and that people are not leaving in quite such dramatic numbers from the countryside, that there are more chances for people in smaller towns, for example, nearer to where they've grown up. What do you feel about that trend? Do you believe it is still set to be a part of China's social landscape for decades to come?
I think really depends. I think in the eastern part of China, for example, in Fujian village, there are some big private-owned enterprises setting up in the nearby towns, which can absorb a lot of the young people to work there. So this kind of move was welcomed by local people because they felt it's working nearby so they can combine family life and the work life. But I think in more rural settings like the Hunan village and the Shandong village, I couldn't see the prospect of these large enterprises setting up nearby. I think a lot of the cash jobs is like working in the supermarket or working kind of floorboards, factories. The income generated from working in these settings is still relatively low in comparison migrating to big cities for work. So really, I think the regional development is really hard to predict to what kind of timeline these kind of things will happen in China.
And you look at primarily three generations, from people born in the 1930s and 40s, particularly, to children born in the 60s and 70s, and then grandchildren mainly born in the 1990s. And obviously, when you come onto one of the key topics in the book, which is marriage and the romantic or spousal relationships, there's obviously a huge change in at least some of the options available to people across those three generations. But again, you're seeing differences between the rural and the urban and the kind of backgrounds that people come from. So tell us a little bit about what you see as the primary trends in the development of marriage and relationships in China.
So first of all, there are a lot of changes in the way people get to know their spouse. And also in terms of the criteria for ideal spouse shifted across different generations. For the grandparent generation, the political credentials of your spouse play a very important role in determining the suitableness of your spouse.
The
And then,
political credentials, so whether they had a good class background or they were a party
yes,
member, for
the
example,
party
in the
man or army
1950s.
man, yeah,
Yeah.
these kind of political credentials. And in post-Mao, so since the 1980s, the economic concern played a very important role. So whether the spouse have a good economic standing and whether their family come from a decent economic background play a role in shaping people's ideas. But also I found remarkable continuities. This urban-rural segregation in terms of the family origin really, really strong across three generations.
In other words, that parents wouldn't want their children to marry someone from a rural background if they were an urban child or something
Yes,
like that.
yes, definitely. There is a very strong tendency to marry someone from a family from compatible backgrounds. And also for women, there is a very gendered, this kind of mobility pattern, is kind of hypergamy. So women tend to marry someone of the same social status or marry up. So this is the expectation in Chinese families. There are very small group of people who marry someone from a rural background. But I always found that, especially these urban women who marry a rural background man, the man always already had a university education, already found a professional job in the urban setting. So in a way, their individual achievement overrides their family background. So in a way, I think love is not blind. It is emotions always mingled with other considerations. And this is something that also found in other societies. For example, in the Western societies, middle-class families tend to find someone from middle-class background. So on that aspect, I think it's very similar to the Chinese families. However, the other element I highlighted in my book is the marriage is not only the union of two individuals, but a union of two families. I think this is probably put Chinese families stand out from other from other Western countries. And as I said earlier, the groom's parents will pay for the deposit of the marital flat. So there's an economical entanglement there. And then later on, when the young couple have children, the grandparenting comes in. So there's practical entanglement again. And then later on, old age support. So that's why I've said it's not a matter of just two individuals conducting their married life. So it's the two families are constantly negotiating upon these everyday obligations and tasks.
Now, I was just going to say, you give an example of an interesting wedding ceremony between a couple called Mr. Gao and Ms. Yin in 2021. And they were both from rural backgrounds, but he was working in a real estate business. She was a nurse in a fourth tier city. And you quote this interesting wedding ceremony where the host read out a message saying, please remember your love towards each other is one of mutual support rather than one of control and demand. But at the same time, you talk about them serving tea to their parents on the stage and how there was this sort of version of patriarchy and the bride was still being kind of ceremonially incorporated into the husband's family and they had paid a bride price, as you put it, of 160,000 yuan. So this is a real kind of mingling of modern ideas and traditions, basically.
That's exactly, yes. A lot of these kind of practices is always a mixture of both the traditional and the modern elements.
But you make the point that, as you just hinted, relationships between, for example, young married couples and the older generation still have what you call a major impact on the quality of conjugal intimacy. In other words, how smoothly their relationship goes may depend quite significantly on the relationship, say, between a daughter-in-law and parents-in-law. And often you do seem to suggest that the pressure is greatest on the women in these situations.
Yes, in the book, I gave, I think, two contrasting examples. One is the couple who are really deeply in love, even when they're in their 50s. And one of the couple really, they were firstly deeply in love, but then during the decades of these frictions between generations, their relationship basically broke down. And what I wanted to say is in the Chinese cases, it is important, these conjugal intimacy need to accommodate the existing intergenerational intimacy. So loving each other is not sufficient to maintain the relationship. You also need to loving both or get on well, at least get on well with both sides of the families.
You have a survey that you quote which says that only around 30% of those born in the 1990s and afterwards felt a sort of intense emotion when they were getting married. You say that around half of them felt some emotion, but it wasn't that intense. And then around 20% of the people who were getting married basically were doing it because they felt under pressure, presumably because of their families' wishes. Is that still so powerful? I mean, we do hear of more young people trying to rebel against parental pressure in China and not get married or not marry at the time the parents want them to.
Yes, there were several layers. The first thing is that not only the pressure from the parents, but also from peer. There were some quotes in that chapter, in the marriage chapter. So they said, at the age of 20, I can fall in love with anyone. But the age of 30, a lot of my friends all got married. So I felt it is time to get married too, because they not only feel the pressure from their parents, but also from peer in the workplace. So my earlier books was looking at the workplace and ethnography. There's hugely pressure from their employers to expect their employees to get married. So there are lots of these matchmaking meetings set up by the HR manager. So this thing is still going on.
Would that even be in private companies or more in state
More
enterprises
in
or
state
work
enterprise,
units?
more in state enterprises. But even in private companies, these everyday kind of gossip and this peer conversation, they always say, "Oh, when are you going to get married?" So that's why I think quite a few the younger generation they feel the pressure. They need to get married by a certain age. So that's why they were not sure. They have some feelings toward their spouse, but they're not completely sure. So that's the feeling what I felt. 凑合, that's the word they use to describe this kind of situation.
Making do or making the
Making
best
do,
of it.
yeah, 凑合. These Chinese were really captured these kind of feelings. And also in terms of rebellion, I think there are rebellions. But also another thing I wanted to say that in the media, there was a lot of reports saying Chinese young people are refused to get married and they live a kind of a lifestyle away from the traditional expectation. But I want to highlight there is an intersection between ageism and sexism, which means some of the women who are in their middle 30s and 40s, their remaining single is involuntary because they are older. Older men can still find younger women to be their wife, but older
Mm.
women so difficult because the age.
And they're talked about it sometimes in this very disparaging phrase, the 剩女, the sort of women who are
Exactly.
kind of left over or on the shelf.
Yes, so we need to be careful. So a lot of the older women who remain single are involuntary decisions. It's the outcome of the ageism and sexism in Chinese society.
Because you make the point that, as you put it, marriage remains effectively obligatory in China. In other words, that there will always be this expectation from families that the children will get married. And you mention that, when children are in their early 20s, the parents are kind of obsessed with who are they going to marry. But if they're still single in their late 20s, then their parents are obsessed with, are they going to get married? And you talk about this phenomenon that most people who've been to China in recent decades will have seen of the marriage markets in parks where parents of unmarried children go and hold up a board with the credentials of their child and see if they can find a suitable match. I mean, is that sort of thing still going on? And are parents still quite so obsessed with their children being married, or is it easier for some to accept that maybe their children will remain single?
Interesting. Again, the age, the life course matters. If the children were still like under 30s, the parents keep pressurizing them. But I think if the children are over 30, some parents give up in a way
Hmm.
and then become less pressurizing their children. But in the end, the parents still ask the question, who are going to look after you in your old age? So that's interesting. Some of the interviewees from my earlier books, again, the number of people who remain single is extremely small, but among the two or three who remain single, they talk to me, they also began to wonder who is going to. So they were thinking about whether adopt children or whether to find someone just for the sake of having children for old age support. So these kind of things is always in the back of their mind.
And you also, to some extent, challenge the idea that there has been a real sexual revolution among the younger generations in China. I mean, you talk about evolution rather than revolution. And you also make the point that what you still see as the pervasive sexualization of everyday life, with particularly advertising and the sort of media content that young people are exposed to, you say that this has very much favored men, as you put it, and also favored a privileged elite.
Yes, that's my point. And I think that that chapter on sex, what I found that the gender differences override urban-rural divide and generational differences. In the post-war China, there has been explosion of public discussions around sex and intimacy in the media space, like in TV dramas framed around love and intimacy. And also with the development of internet, you can search for these discussions everywhere. However, I think one of the issues is the women's autonomy and agency in these sexual discourses still remain very limited. In my earlier book, I participated in a lot of these business banquets. These company sales professionals held with their clients. And as most businessmen, rich people tend to be men. So that's in those environments, it is typical that men are telling sex jokes to women. And these sexualized expectations and activities are happening to professional women as well. But a lot of the women, most of the time, they're just being silent. They couldn't find any kind of organizational support to facilitate them to challenge these kind of sexual jokes and sexual harassment. And the second thing is the reputation, women's reputation, the expectation that women should be responsible for their sexual reputation. So to be silent in those occasions is the most wise behavior they can do.
You make the point that there's still a kind of what you call a virgin complex, even though more people are clearly having premarital sex, although you say that the numbers of partners remains pretty low in
Yes.
China. But you give a case of a young woman who posted online pictures of her with her boyfriend when she was at university, and then her mother was saying, well, what are you going to do if your relationship ends and everyone will know you've already had a relationship? And in fact, when she did break up with her boyfriend, you say that her mother wanted her to have hymen replacement surgery. So this is still a kind of incredible pressure on women, the way that you depict it.
Yes, exactly. And these sexual reputation of a woman still matter a lot in the marriage negotiations between two extended family.
But you do give a case of someone who is you describe as an exception, who's from one of the villages in rural Shandong province, and she went to university and eventually started dating a lot of foreign men,
Yes.
apparently, you say, and she was also involved with feminist groups. But you see her as a bit of an outlier, someone who is really just seeking their own pleasure and not really worrying about what society thinks of them.
Yes, because her association with the feminist group give her the access to these alternative discussions around women's autonomy in sexual pleasure. So she broadened her mindset. She wouldn't think it's an issue. So she had multiple sexual relationships with a series of foreign men. But again, as I mentioned in the book, In a way, she is in that position. She would not be able to find another Chinese man for marriage because her reputation was ruined. So I think a lot of the women I encountered, they are not really closely associated with the feminist discussions and on sex and women's autonomy, etc. So that's why their mindset was still very constrained by these gendered norms around the sexual reputation.
And you quote a man who says that Chinese women are not really feminists, even the highly educated ones, and that many people really are still looking to find someone that they can rely on financially.
That expectation is still there. I can see. For the one-child generation who were born in the 1980s, many were highly educated, earning a professional income themselves. If their husbands failed to breed the breadwinner financially, they still look down upon them.
You quote a mother and
Mother and
daughter,
daughter.
both
Yes,
who looked down on their husbands because they hadn't done so well in their careers, even though the husband of the younger one was incredibly helpful and did all the housework, but somehow that wasn't considered acceptable.
because this gender role division that the women were supposed to provide the domestic work and the man supposed to bring the financial income to the family, these gender role stereotypes are so deeply embedded. So if a man failed to bring the big bucks to the family, even they doing very well in the domestic work, I don't think they will win their favor from
And
this
that
wife.
and that applies across the country, do you think? I mean, it won't be different in the biggest cities, for example.
I mean, as far as in my sample, I couldn't see the differences.
One of the things that is very striking is that in your discussions of people's relationships and marriage, that you talk quite a lot to people of different generations. You ask them, would they still marry the same person again if they had a second chance, as it were? And it's really fascinating because some of the older people say that they absolutely would, and some of the younger people say that they wouldn't. And it's such a spectrum, as you say. It's not necessarily a linear change, but you also talk about at least one very specific case of sexual violence. And this was a woman who ended up having an affair, but at the same time still didn't feel that she was able to necessarily leave her husband. To what extent is that still a phenomenon in China? And do you think that it's similar in how common it is to other countries, or do you think that is a particular problem?
I think it is not just unique to China because a lot of studies about other societies also found the sexual violence in the domestic settings. That particular case, I think a wife beating was quite widely reported among the older generations in rural villages. And also, I found that cases of these domestic violence happening in urban China as well. I mean, it's just so difficult to evaluate the scale of it because I couldn't do a kind of a comprehensive survey. But I think these domestic violence cases still exist in Chinese family. This is for certain.
But do you think that some kinds of patriarchal attitudes have changed? That there is a generation of educated urban men who do have slightly different attitudes to women and are not necessarily so macho, I guess we could say, in their behavior.
Yes, of course, yes. Among the younger generation men, their wife are working outside home. Has all become a norm, widely accepted by many Chinese men. And also the media discussions, there were expectation for men to be more involved in family life, to be caring fathers, to be more involved in raising children. So I think these discussions will have an impact upon the ways how Chinese young men behave in their domestic settings.
And one thing, as we mentioned, you touch upon is the idea of grandparenting, and you make the point that although there's always been respect for the older generation in Chinese families, and that was expected, the more proactive role of grandparents in often bringing up children, whether that's in the cities where the two parents are out to work, or in the countryside where some of these so-called left behind children have been left with the grandparents, that this is actually something relatively modern, and this is a result of all that socio-economic change of recent decades.
Yes, that grandparenting is really example how tradition can be reinvented. Because I think the earlier generation, grandparenting was not the norm.
To have this sort of active role.
Yes, it was really the institutional policy context which lead to the prevalence of grandparenting in both urban and rural China.
Well, one thing that has meant in recent decades is that many young couples, when they have a child, end up living with one set of in-laws who play a major role in looking after the grandchildren, often the grandmothers in particular. But is that still as common as it was, say, 20 years ago? I mean, we do hear these days of some young people who don't want so much involvement from their parents, and indeed of some new grandparents who are not quite so keen to become full-time carers for their grandchildren. And in the book you mentioned the case of a grandmother in Guangzhou who didn't want to look after her daughter's second child.
Yes, that particular case, when they had the first child, it was purely her mother who took on the grandparenting role. And when they had the second child, they consulted with the grandmother first, but the grandmother didn't want to do it. So they have to utilize a market-paid carer to come to live with them. But that family was wealthy, but many other families didn't have that economic means in some way which contribute to their decision not having a second child.
Yeah.
That's also explained since the introduction of the two-child policy, only 5 to 10% of couples eligible for this policy have taken up this offer.
And you make the point that the majority of them say that it's because they don't have carers to look after more children. So do you think that we are pretty much stuck in a kind of one-child mentality for the foreseeable future in China?
I think unless the government provides more childcare facility for the children under the age of 3, and also give other financial incentives to couples, most likely, I think the urban couples are reluctant to have more children. However, the picture is different in rural China because there is very strong son preferences.
They still want to have a male heir.
The demographic profile is always the older siblings are daughters, and then the youngest is the son. So I think if the younger rural couples, if they haven't got a son, they definitely will continue until they have a son.
And in terms of the grandparents, obviously, that also touches on the issue that you discuss in the last chapter of the book, which is about who is actually going to look after people when they get older. And obviously, we hear a lot about China and its aging population issues, and we've seen the birth rate declining, and the population, I believe, has declined a little as well in recent times. So to what extent are young people still willing to fulfill that traditional sort of filial role of looking after their elderly parents in a much more atomized and diverse society?
I think almost all the younger interviewees pledge to provide the support when the time is ripe. In the interview setting, they want to project themselves as being filial. Being unfilial is really the worst crime in Chinese society. However, the parents of the urban families pointed out a structural discrepancy because one hand is they only have one child, and the other hand, these aging population emerging. So there is kind of oscillation among the urban families that the parents, whether to rely upon their child or going to a care home. I think they still emotionally prefer to rely, but they feel maybe practically it will be impossible. But in rural China, it's different. In rural China, going to a care home is a disgrace. People associate the care home only with people who have no children, which they really have this negative term called 绝户头 is a very negative term in the community setting. So I think for rural parents, none of them actually consider, because they said, why? When I ask the question, I have children, why I go to the old age care homes? But in urban China, parents started thinking about that.
But you also make the point that given the sort of explosion of the Chinese real estate market and the fact that most families put so much of their money into property over recent decades, that you say that this financial importance of urban parental property is now a powerful weapon to prevent children straying from the filial path of caring for their parents.
Yes, that's a very important argument I developed in. So what I see is the urban parents and rural parents has divergent trajectories because the devaluation of the rural accommodation, they didn't have a proper market value for the rural housing they held. So they couldn't utilize this kind of housing as a bargaining chip. But in urban China, it's different. A lot of their flats are multiple 100 times the value. So it's just substantial inheritance for their children. So I think this is another concern, although people would not say I look after them because I'm concerned. But in practice, I can see that there are some cases where family enter dispute in terms of how their parents' property should be divided among children. And there's a lot of quarrels and among those previously very intimate relatives.
And presumably, if people have more children, that sort of thing will become more common. Just one more question. In terms of the people who are working as migrant workers in Chinese cities, are you still seeing that most of them are thinking or having no choice but to think of returning to their original rural home areas when they retire?
Majority of the first generation of migrants will return because it's just beyond their means to purchase a home in the cities where they migrate. But there is a trend, as I identified in the book, is they might tend to reside in the county, which is close to their village. So there is a small group of migrants who have accumulated some kinds of savings. They might use that to purchase a flat in the nearby counties.
In the sort of county town.
County town, yes.
Liu Jieyu, thank you so much for talking to us on China in Context.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure.
And Professor Liu's book, Embedded Generations, is published by Princeton University Press. Well, that's all we have time for on this episode. You can find out more about SOAS China Institute events and read our blog on our website, soas.ac.uk. But for now, thanks for listening and goodbye.